We are happy that you make it here. You've made it here, that you are here at the lecture of Professor James Clifford from University of California, Santa Cruz. A very nice environment to work. But weather is the same, I think. And well, it's very hard, very difficult to introduce a person of such an international standing as James Clifford, one of the persons who has made a great contribution to the development of late 20th century anthropology. And all of us probably have read at least pieces of the book co-edited by him with Marcus on writing culture, which is considered a milestone in anthropology. You agree with it or not? You are postmodernist or anti-postmodernist, but you have to make a reference to this contribution. James Clifford was educated step by step, as all of us, but in a distinguished schools like Haverford College in Pennsylvania, where he got his BA. Then he spent a year in London School of Economics, or at London School of Economics, and Political Sciences. So there is a European touch to his education, although I'm not sure if Britain is Europe. Then he did his MA at Stanford University and PhD at Harvard University in history in 1977. Immediately after this, he started his job, his work at the Department of History of Consciousness that was established de facto by him and Hayden White, whom we also hosted here some time ago, several times, and is until today is a professor in this department, in this postgraduate program. Well, let me simply enumerate some books that he has published or edited besides Writing Culture. His first book was published in 1992. The title was Person and Myth. It was about Maurice Linehart in Melanesia, which, as far as I know, was a transformation of your PhD, of his PhD. Then Writing Culture, soon 4 years later, Writing Culture that has been translated into several languages, including Spanish, Italian, and Japanese. And then The Predicament of Culture, which we are lucky enough to have also in Polish, which was translated in even more languages, and for instance, Chinese translation is in progress. In 1997, Professor Clifford published Roots, Travel and Translation in the Late 20th Century, a piece of which was also sent to the participants of this seminar in 2003. So you see, you shouldn't publish too often. It's not a question of bibliometric, it's a question of impact on the people, on the way people think. The very small but very popular series in Prickly Paradigm Press, based in Chicago, on the edges of anthropology. Only very celebrated scholars can publish in this series. And from the talk we had yesterday, I know that a new book has been just completed, and the title would be Returns. So no roots, but returns. But I hope that Professor Clifford can tell much more about it. I hope, I'm sure he can tell much more about it than I can do. Well, it is very difficult to even to give an initial image how important Professor Clifford's writings were to the anthropology, but also to the anthropology in this country. There are several books and articles on this. There are translations. And there are also many discussions in the seminars. And, well, from my own experience, I can tell you that all students who attend my seminar almost by heart have to know identity in Mashpee. I think one of the best texts that has ever been written on identity in the history of anthropology. Frederick Barth is cited more often, but I think it should be James Clifford. Let me welcome Professor James Clifford, please.
Well, can you all hear me? Thank you, Professor Bukolski, for that overly generous introduction. I'm actually honored to be paired with Frederick Barth, who, an important influence, not adequately acknowledged, but very important. And I hope all of you, I was sitting there appreciating the incongruity of these two images and thinking, well, we've come a long way, I think. But then I was thinking, well, in some way, they're both images of, as I hope you'll see, of knowledge or learning or culture or heritage or something. You know, there's something in common about what's going on in the painting and what's going on here, as I hope you'll see. My remarks today are a report from Kodiak, Alaska, a place I've been visiting over the past 8 years as part of a comparative research project on indigenous cultural politics. And I focus on an exhibition of traditional masks at the Alutiiq Museum in Kodiak, an exhibition during the summer of 2008. The masks had not been seen in Alaska since they were collected and taken to Europe more than 100 years before, in 1871. Their return on loan was felt by many to be a defining moment in the accelerating local activities of cultural renewal and identity assertion. But the mask's return has not been in any direct sense a revival, a going back to a past life. They now live in a changed and changing homeland where they're making new or translated meanings. And this is their second life as heritage. That was the second life in my title, Repatriation and the Second Life of Heritage. I argue that to understand this life, this second life, in an adequate, non-stereotypic way, we need to see the masks as participating in overlapping, discrepant, different contexts. They make meanings in local worlds of cultural transmission and invention, and also in emerging venues of indigenous mobilization and public performance, in art practices, in museum displays, and in cultural exchanges. And most generally, in this talk and in the book of which it's a part, I'm working toward a realist account, neither idealized nor dismissive of native or tribal societies today, a way to understand them as sites of materially constrained, historically specific possibility. So I'm beginning with a snapshot, a picture I took in passing from the basement workshop of Sven Håkansson Jr., who is director of the Alutiiq Museum in Kodiak. I used the image with his permission. Sven Håkansson grew up in Old Harbor, one of the remote villages on Kodiak Island. In the late 18th century, this settlement was the first Russian outpost in Alaska. I'm sure perhaps you recall that Alaska was first colonized by the Russians. Though his father was a respected elder and village leader, Håkansson admits that as a teenager he learned little of his native culture and history, expecting, like his high school classmates, to lead a life of semi-employment, fishing commercially and guiding hunting parties. In 1981, while supporting himself as a fisherman, he found his way to a youth conference in Denmark, where he heard a lecture by the leading historian of Russian America, Dr. Lydia Black. Why, he wondered, did I have to come halfway around the world to learn about my own history? Haakonson then attended the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, an environment where native culture was studied and identification encouraged. He learned Russian, went to Harvard in anthropology on a fellowship for indigenous scholars, did fieldwork among reindeer herders in Siberia, and while still finishing his dissertation, was named to direct the new museum in Kodiak. When I visited there in 2007, he described the museum's varied programs, all contributing, he said, to one fundamental goal. The goal is to make it possible for future Alutiiq youth, whether they grow up in a remote village in Kodiak or in urban Anchorage, where increasing numbers now live, to make it possible for those youth to take pride and to understand their history and culture. This will give us a sense of where we are. Kodiak Island is right here. It's a rather large island, almost completely uninhabited except by the famous Kodiak bears, who are the world's largest carnivores, mammal carnivores, they claim. And this map is about 30 years old. And I picked it because it shows the changing names of the people in question. You'll see that in the north, in the blue section, blue denotes an Eskimoan language. And these are cultures that the anthropologists classified according to language. And these are all Eskimoan languages, and an Eskimoan family goes all the way to Greenland across the top of Canada. The North Alaskan Eskimo, you can see, and then going down the Bering Sea Eskimo. I don't know if you can read these in the back. And then coming on into the Gulf of Alaska, the Pacific Eskimo. And the people in question, who I've been calling Alutiiq, and who call themselves either Alutiiq or sometimes Sugpiaq, and I use both names as they do. These people have now re-identified and no longer called Pacific Eskimo, as the anthropologists call them, and nor called Aleut, as the Russians call them, but have re-identified as Alutiiq. And so the Bering Sea Eskimos are now Yupik, the North Alaskan Eskimo are Inupiat, and the Aleuts, the Aleutian Islands, the Aleuts now prefer to be called Unangan. And this renaming is, of course, part of indigenous identity politics, where you take off the colonial name and reach back to recover or even reinvent some indigenous name. The changing names reflect new contexts of indigenous identity politics that have taken shape in the wake of the struggles from the 1960s for social inclusion, for land restoration, and for cultural recognition. They also reflect a governmental project, which is known as the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is usually referred to by its acronym, ANCA, ANCSA, A-N-C-A. Now, ANCSA was a historic piece of legislation that attempted to organize Alaska's Native peoples in new governmental and corporate institutions that were better adapted to economic development. You must understand that in Alaska, the history of colonization among Native peoples was different from in the lower 48 states of the United States, and also in Hawaii. There were no reservations in Alaska. Alaska is a territory bigger than the state of Texas, which is pretty big, with less than 1 million inhabitants. So it has the number of inhabitants of one borough of New York City, and it's spread, well, it's not spread. There's an enormous amount of empty space, and the whole question of land title was unclear. There was not a history of conquest where native peoples were rounded up and stuck into reservations, and then settler colonial people came in and occupied all the rest of the land. That didn't happen in Alaska. The settlers were few, relatively few, and they came largely for extractive purposes. First to get gold, and now they're up there to get oil and gas and timber. So this is the Alaska situation, but it means that the question of natives were not then organized into, quote, tribes, the way they were in many other places. Part of being a tribe was having a relationship with a dominant government, a government-to-government relationship. This wasn't necessary in Alaska in the same way. So they're not tribes in the same sense. But there are people, of course, there are communities, there are people with memories, there are people with languages, there are people with different cultures. All of these existed and continue to exist, but they didn't fall into those governmental categories that you find in the lower, we call them the lower 48 states of the United States. Okay, it's important to know that. ANCSA, this Native Claim Settlement Act, was an attempt to settle and organize the question of land in Alaska, give quite a large amount of land to native peoples, surviving native peoples, a lot of land and a lot of money, and organize them in native corporations. And this mode of government, if you like, or if we were followers of Michel Foucault, we might say form of governmentality, which you see not only governs people, but organizes them ethnically. Because Alutiiq people who actually 25 years ago probably identified themselves as Aleut, or maybe Russian even, they had or maybe something else, suddenly needed to have an ethnic identity within a larger structure of Alaskan native identity politics. And so Alutiiq identification was encouraged. If you wanted to be part of the settlement and get the benefits of the settlement, you had to sign up. Okay. These changing indigenous contexts, old and new tribal institutions, are still in process, and they're being articulated and used both from above and below. And they're both locally rooted and engaged in wider culture and economic powers. The local traditions didn't stop. I mean, they flow into this new context, but it's a context which is in some way organized or circumscribed from above. So it's the old question that we always face: who is using who? Who is using who in this new governmental structure? Heritage renewal and performance has, however, been a central feature of these new forms of localism and connectivity. Sven Håkansson's native identity took shape in a somewhat later part of the process after the ANCSA re-identification went on, and his was a more international or cosmopolitan indigenous situation. After all, his epiphany, his coming to awareness of his indigenousness, took place in Copenhagen, in an international indigenous meeting of some kind. And this interconnected world of pan-Alaskan, circumpolar, indeed worldwide indigenous resurgence would provoke a sharpened awareness of colonization's destructive effects and also their colonization's transformative effects, while simultaneously supporting a desire to reach back to older pre-contact cultural roots. And in many native settings, a deep history can now be renewed through activities ranging from land claims and managed forms of subsistence to revived dancing and inventive tribal art. I'll have more to say later about this category, tribal art. Let's look around Sven Håkansson's workshop. In addition to doing what museum directors do, organizing exhibits and getting grants and managing a complex institution, Sven Håkansson is also an artist, or at least someone who makes heritage. He makes traditional heritage, new traditional heritage, and you can see this going on in this picture. He makes kayaks, he makes baskets, he makes masks. This image is a snapshot taken in passing, but we can see in it juxtaposed elements of a composite native heritage, a way of life in process. In the right front, this woodworking kit will be familiar to many hobbyists, people who work with this as a tool. It supports the craft of heritage, a remaking that involves returning to old or lost forms in new circumstances. Old things are fashioned with new techniques, here electric drills and routers, fashioned from explicit models, photos, pencil diagrams, and in novel cultural categories, the categories called culture, identity, art. These are new forms. The masks seen here are traditional, meaning based on 19th century models. Now the poster in the background, as you can see in the upper part, the poster is from a French exhibit of Aleutic masks, which was the first production of the new Musée du Quai Branly in Paris. And through an accident of history, virtually all of the surviving 19th century Aleutic masks are currently in France. Reconnecting this heritage then in the 21st century involves travel in space as well as in time. Travels, as we will see, back and forth to Europe. It also requires productive and reproductive practices of research, of copying, of inscription, of photography, and standardization. Something of that standardization can be seen perhaps in the line drawings up here to the right. Now, moving to the left in the picture, Russian Orthodoxy, the religion. Russian Orthodoxy has sunk local roots over 2 centuries in Alaska, and it functions today as a true native religion. I hope that I will just repeat that because to me it's a really important element of this particular culture, that their native religion is Russian Orthodoxy, an authentic native religion, I might add. And the presence of Russian Orthodoxy in the heritage mixture is registered by a small icon pinned at the upper left. Can you see the icon? Wait, are we in the right picture? Oh, you got them out of order. No, here it is. There's a small icon. And we can just glimpse the distinctive Orthodox crosses in a mostly obscured postcard in front of the French poster. Now the strips clamped together just below the icon, right here, are, Sven tells me, a wood outline for a Christmas ornament he was making for his daughter. And the shape is based on petroglyphs, that is, old inscriptions on stone, of course, from the remote western tip of Kodiak Island. Designs that have been adopted as symbols of a deep pre-contact Sugpiaq past, and which appear as logos on t-shirts and bags and caps sold by the museum. Thank you. Overlapping the poster from France, there's a surprising addition. It's a reproduction of a 19th century portrait of a Maori tribal leader. The man's grandson recently visited from New Zealand and stayed a while in Kodiak to teach Maori techniques of stone carving at the Aleutic Museum. The elaborately tattooed face joins the others on the workshop wall like one more mask and an index of today's circuits of transnational indigeneity, in this case a New Zealand-Alaska connection. Moving across to the right, behind some small ornamental carvings, we can see 2 photographs, 2 snapshots. Pictures of Sven's nephew and brother-in-law hunting and fishing. Hunting and fishing. In Alaska and throughout the western United States and Canada, hunting, fishing, and gathering, now are often called subsistence rights, are claimed as central elements of indigenous tradition. There are also, of course, areas of tension and negotiation with the state, with non-native hunters and fishers, and sometimes with environmentalists. All of this part of an ongoing political struggle around land use and sovereignty. Looking again at the whole image, we can see at the left edge a map of Antarctica. Antarctica? Why? I don't know. A different circumpolar face of the whole planet, maybe? The whole world seen from another side? Because, you know, we're on the Arctic here, in the upper top. And that large piece of fiberboard in the middle that's blocking our view, well, we might interpret it as a reminder of limitation, of what can't be seen from this angle of vision. What follows, therefore, are the observations of a visitor, a positioned visitor, ethnographically and historically interested, but an outsider. Now, but this is a picture of Kodiak, Alaska, and I'll leave it up for a while just to keep you in the Alaska mood, a rather distinctive mix of nature and culture here. But I will just point out one distinctive feature in it, which is that that little building in the lower left is a banya, which is a Russian steam bath, something that has been appropriated by native peoples, but not only native peoples there. Everybody loves their banya. Before describing the return of the mass to Kodiak, I want to raise some general questions about the kind of heritage work I'll be discussing. Heritage is a complex term with many semantic neighbors. Tradition, patrimoine, costumbre, coutume, custom in Melanesia, adat in Indonesia, and many other terms we could use. Heritage covers many different historical situations and interactive relationships, from repatriated tribal objects to English country houses. The critical literatures on heritage industries and the invention of tradition, Hobsbawm and Ranger, are by now familiar. My remarks today are an attempt to see beyond this powerful but ultimately dismissive critical approach. And in this critical vein, heritage tends to be seen as basically a kind of organized or politicized nostalgia. Words like kitsch, ersatz culture, touristification, objectification, and commodification recur. In the work of authors such as David Harvey, the general critique extends to many realms of cultural production associated with so-called post-modernity. I might also mention Dean McCannell's concept of staged authenticity in touristic venues, or Jean Baudrillard's simulacra, and also the way that a phrase like identity politics, at least where I come from, identity politics so often carries the negative connotation of essentialist self-promotion. Historically minded anthropologists have responded to these critiques by arguing that cultural reinvention is quite common, actually, in the life of all communities, and there were cycles of rupture and renewal in pre-contact indigenous societies, new articulations, not inventions of tradition, but traditions of invention. Marshall Solins has theorized this point very powerfully. Some of you may know his work, recent work, showing the culturally specific ways that indigenous people have engaged with and processed and localized the modern capitalist world system. And if pre-modern Europe, Solins writes, if pre-modern Europe could have a renaissance without falling into inauthenticity, why not indigenous societies today? These arguments are important. I've made them myself, yet they have areas of blindness. They can make it a bit too easy to forget that we're in a very different moment from 15th century Europe and that Renaissance. The large-scale and irreversible histories of colonization or capitalist expansion have produced unprecedented ruptures and discontinuities. And particularly in the case of small-scale tribal societies, the ruptures have been devastating. Military and commercial invasion, epidemics, exile from ancestral lands, etc. The forced acculturations and transformations lived through by those who survived these initial shocks have been, and often still are, relentless. There's no going back. Thus, we need always to make a place in our understanding for the powerful, tendential, restructuring forces that are summarized in terms like modernity or capitalism. But what weight can be accorded to these structural forces? How do they configure and empower cultural action? I follow Raymond Williams' now classic discussion of determination, and determination is not the same as determinism. We might talk about economic determinism. Determination is a more flexible and open form, but which takes seriously the idea that one is always operating within institutional and materially constrained parameters. And in Williams' notion of determination, he writes not about this causing that kind of determination, but more a notion of pressures and limits, horizons and pressures, let's say, constraints and negotiations within constraints, a range of possibilities rather than inevitable outcomes. In actual practice, the changes at work for indigenous societies have been uneven and composed of syncretic formations, complex translations, detours, and hesitations. For example, in the many current contexts of indigenous renewal, along with cultural destruction and social transformation, we can observe a continuation of older forms, persistent and embattled histories. To recognize this fact is to return limited but real agency to the victims of progress, better understanding the inventive persistence of societies once assumed to be doomed by history. Heritage in this perspective is neither a recovered source of identity nor a commodified, objectified product. It's something more interesting, messy, and hard to circumscribe. There it is. Let me just note a few sources for my thinking. One provocative formulation comes from Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett. I don't know if any of you know her work, her book, Destination Culture, on tourism and heritage. It's a wonderful book. Barbara is actually currently in Warsaw, has been for a number of years, and she's the chief organizer of the Museum of Jewish History in Poland, which is quite a task, I'm sure. Kirschenblatt-Gimblett writes about the phrase, the second life of heritage, and it's from her that I've taken it. But what kind of successor life, what kind of second life could this be, actually? Kirschenblatt-Gimblett offers a minimal definition that opens up conceptual and, I think, political space. Quote, she writes, "I wish to underscore that heritage is not lost and found, stolen and reclaimed. It is a mode of cultural production in the present that has recourse to the past." A mode of cultural production in the present that has recourse to the past. Now, this non-judgmental, minimalist formula, I think, usefully suspends value judgments and authenticity claims, allowing us to focus on what is actually at work, what from the past is currently being made and remade in specific relational social contexts. And working in this general vein, Jeffrey Chandler, in a remarkable recent book called Adventures in Yiddishland from 2005, introduces a notion that I found very useful, the notion of post-vernacular language and culture. And I'll dwell for a moment on this idea of post-vernacular. Yiddish, of course, the native language of Ashkenazic Jews, was eliminated by the Nazis as a communal form of life in Eastern Europe, and in Israel it was suppressed in favor of Hebrew. Elsewhere, except in a few Orthodox communities, maybe in Brooklyn, New York, it's disappearing as a language of everyday interaction. But Yiddish nonetheless enjoys a second life in extensive and lively performances and institutions, in new media and social settings, in self-aware expressions of diasporic Jewishness. And Chandler's book is full of examples. He argues that post-vernacular languages are performative. By this he means their significance inheres as much in the very fact that they are being used as in the content of their utterance. Moreover, for Chandler, post does not presume a secondary status. Rather, it evokes a new kind of cultural flourishing. And here's a quotation from Chandler. Quote, post-vernacularity can be a liberating concept, prompting possibilities of language use other than the vernacular model of full fluency in the indigenous mother tongue. Thus, post-vernacularity has important implications for the interrelation of language, culture, and identity, indeed for the notion of what might constitute a speech community, end quote. I found that a perspective like Chandler's clears the air when evaluating the native language preservation and revival projects undertaken these days in many places like the Alutiiq Museum. In the absence of monolingual or robustly bilingual contexts of everyday language use, indigenous heritage languages are being recorded, archived, and learned as second languages. Chandler's perspective helps us see and appreciate not so much native languages as what we might call languages of nativeness. The approach suspends normative ideas of cultural wholeness or organic speech communities, weighing instead the importance of selectively rearticulated cultural and linguistic forms, performances adapted to changing interactive situations. And I think of the rather elaborate invocations in native languages, which are now very common in places like Canada, Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and other places. At the beginning of all sorts of events, it will be important to speak in an indigenous language. And it may or may not be understood or completely understood by the audience, but its performativity, its significance is the fact that it's being spoken at all. And these performative languages have their own symbolic as well as communicative functions. It makes little sense to compare these, and it's not only ritual languages like this, but it's kind of languages that are being learned in community settings or being used at potlatch ceremonies, for example, among Northwest Coast Indians. It makes little sense to compare these languages, learned as second languages, with speech that was widely used decades ago and is now recalled only by a handful of elders. Post-vernacular languages find a second life in complex multilingual worlds, the expanding public spheres of indigenous renewal and heritage activism. And this is the real world. This is where these languages exist, worlds of multilingualism. The second life of heritage comes, though, with no historical or political guarantees. It's open-ended, it's relational, and it's contingent. Yet something real, both old and new, something actively reassembled is happening here. Something our holistic concepts of culture, identity, and historical development are ill-equipped to recognize. Parenthetically, you'll see I'm still worrying about the same things I worried about in that essay in Identity and Mashpee. Let's return to the masks in Sven Haakonsson's studio. That's not where we are, but don't worry about it. During the past few decades, mask carving has found a new vitality in native Alaska. All along the coast, stretching south into Canada, native artists and carvers make masks as symbols of clan or tribal continuity and power. And these new masks are used in ritual life, in potlatches among the southern tribes in Alaska, or in midwinter gatherings by the Yupik of western Alaska. But masks are also made for art galleries and for display in museums and cultural centers and as objects of social exchange and gift giving. Masks modeled on traditional designs, newly carved creations, are what we might call heritage objects. They have multiple public functions, and they may be used in traditional ceremonies, at dance performances, at festivals or openings. We'll see some of those in a moment. Or taught in craft classes to children or adults in schools or in cultural centers like the Alutiiq Museum. Here are just a few quick examples of contemporary masks in Alaska. This one was carved by the Alutiiq carver Doug Inga, who we'll meet later in a different context. And it was created for a storytelling festival in 2003. And here it's hanging in Anchorage in the Alaska Native Heritage Center. And these Yupik masks are on display at the Alaska Native Medical Center in Anchorage. This is a medical center that is designed for indigenous people. These masks are high art, we might call, Northwest Coast masks, very expensive masks, in a living room of some wealthy collectors in Vancouver. This is the high art dimension. And this, distorted, it looks, getting the images together was a heroic task, I have to say, performed by Mario Philipp in the nick of time, but not every image got in exactly right. This mask should be long, not wide. But it's a mask by an Alutiiq artist, Jerry Lactonen, and it commemorates the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I don't know if you all remember that, a disaster from 1989. That oil completely encircled Kodiak Island. They were the major victims of that spill, destroying Lactonen's livelihood as a fisherman and pushing him toward the career in making art. And the construction of the Alutiiq Museum, which we'll see in a moment, a decade later, was largely paid for with funds from the oil spill compensation process. Masks which feature striking human and animal forms and can conveniently be hung on walls make very good works of art. And as such, they circulate in established systems of collecting and valuation. They also represent recovered tradition in communities where 20th century missionary prohibitions or government suppression of rituals like the potlatch had forced masked dancing to go underground. Now, just north of the Alutiiq in the Kuskokwim and Yukon deltas, imagine that also long, not spread out. This is, let's see how the next one looks. Now, how do you go back? You don't go back, right? No backspace. The backspace, really? I'm using a program I've never used before. Well, don't worry, up. Oh, there we are. That was a missing slide. Well, we're just going to, oh my God. Well, okay, now we're just going to try to catch up here. We had system translation problems with respect to different files, different computers, different JPEG images that were saved in different ways. So, come on. Oh no. So we're in a loop. We need to somehow get further along here. You see, it's doing a loop in the first part of it. Okay, this distorted image, but it was already distorted. The surrealists love these masks. These are Yupik masks from just north of the Alutiiq people. And these masks were very familiar in the world of so-called primitive art in the 1920s and 30s. I said the surrealists adored Yupik masks, and I think probably you can see for obvious reasons. And and south of the Alutiiq, the northwest coast, you know, with their totem poles, their beautiful big masks, very well known. The Alutiiq had nothing like that. They didn't have big, iconic images. And they have suffered from a kind of inferiority complex in that regard. They've never enjoyed similar visibility, and they've sometimes struggled with a sense of cultural inferiority compared with the surrounding tribes. Now, their history of disruption and loss was, in fact, especially severe. The Russians arrived early. They imposed a draconian forced labor regime in the quest for furs. Sheer survival required major accommodation by inhabitants of the Aleutian Islands and the Kodiak Archipelago, adoption of Russian language, religion, and social forms. Throughout the 19th century, epidemics, diseases, devastated local communities, devastated. And after 1867, when the Americans bought Alaska from the Russians, what right did they have to buy Alaska, one might ask. Indigenous people ask that all the time. After 1867, a new imperial ruler, the United States, brought fresh missionaries, boarding schools, and especially during World War II, a major military presence. 20th century natural disasters, volcanic eruptions, a major tsunami, all of these disrupted traditional communities. And as the post-1960s indigenous revivals gathered momentum, many Alutiiq people remained uncertain whether they should consider themselves Russian or American or Aleut or Eskimo. And as the new term Alutiiq took hold in the 1970s after ANCSA, the need for a usable native heritage became crucial. There were ongoing social continuities in families and villages, of course, but no spectacular symbols of Alutiiq culture or art. In this context, archaeology became a very important part, and I won't dwell on this aspect of the heritage work in Kodiak, but archaeology, in fact, played a very big part in very interesting collaborations between academic anthropologists and local communities. And they developed forms of community archaeology, which involved community members in the dig, in the actual archaeology at every point. But I can't go into that in any detail. I'd rather take you to the museum. And this is a picture of, again, of looking out over Kodiak. The foreground, you can see the roof of the museum. Behind it, you can see the Russian Orthodox Cathedral, which is right next door, across the street from the Alutiiq Museum. It occupies the ground floor of this rather severely functional new building. On the upper floor are the offices of native corporations that had been created by ANCSA on the second floor. Now, the question of what to put inside the museum is an open one, because if so much of their heritage that they had in the form of objects were archaeological artifacts, I mean, archaeological artifacts, at least in this context, are not very dramatic. You can see that these are not all that inspiring, although some of these actually have faces on them. They're not as inspiring as some of those Yupik masks. So what's inside the museum? Here's some shots inside the museum. Of course, a Kodiak bear, some reproductions of paintings by the great Russian painter Tikhonov from the early 19th century. A kayak and some artwork, all done by contemporary Alutiiq artists. Actually, some videos of archaeological excavations, and a gift shop which features local artists. The gift shop actually is an important part of heritage revival because it gives artists, craftspeople, a venue, a place to sell. Now it's balking again. Oh, we see now, every time it does that, we end up going back to the start, so bring us up. While we're doing this, so why were there, I guess the question, one of the question then is, why were there no Alutiiq masks? What to put in the museum? Here's an example of what I would call a newly authentic heritage object. This is a parka, a squirrel skin parka that was sewed. You can see how intricately it's sewed out of many different animal skins, aquatic and land-based animals. These were sold by a couple of women, Alutiiq women, who went to Washington, D.C. to study the original that is in the Smithsonian Institution and then produced a replica. And that, you know, exists as it's a rather impressive work of art. I mean, we'll raise the question later about how to think about authenticity in the context of a heritage object like this. But what happened to the masks? Well, masking had been an important part of Alutiiq tradition and culture in the 19th century for all sorts of social and religious functions. But it was traditional, at that time it was traditional that after the masks were carved, and after they were performed, they were burned. They were destroyed. And they were either mostly burned or sometimes left to rot, to decay in secret caves. So that when, in the late 19th century, after all of the disruptions caused by disease and imperial invasion and so forth, brought the end of mask dancing, there weren't any old masks left, because it was the right thing to do after using them was to destroy them, or to allow them to disintegrate. So there weren't any left. Now, there were one or two in Leningrad that the Russians had acquired, and there were one or two in Washington, D.C. that had been collected by Americans in the 19th century. But they weren't very impressive. And Aleutic artists who were part of the revival and wanted to be making masks really had no models, and were frustrated. They wanted something, as one of them said, something significant, something spectacular, something to rival the coastal Indian art of our neighbors, something that defined me and the island. Now, there were rumors that a cache of old masks was hidden somewhere in Europe, and the rumor turned out to be true. In 1871, a 19-year-old French adventurer named Alphonse Pinard traveled by kayak in the Aleutian Islands and the Kodiak archipelago for about a year. And this amateur linguist and ethnographer acquired 70 Sukpiak masks. Some were made specifically for him, and a few he may have surreptitiously appropriated from caves, quote, in the name of science. Pinard managed to transport all his artifacts back to France, where he exhibited them in Paris, and then donated the whole collection to his local museum, the Chateau Musée in Boulogne-sur-Mer. Boulogne-sur-Mer is a little fishing town on the English Channel. There, they were preserved and for many years forgotten. Pinard had in fact rescued the masks, not just, as he thought, for science, but also for the people who, a century later, came to recognize themselves as Aleutic. Without him, a precious cultural legacy would certainly have been lost. The staff of the Chateau Musée carefully protected the collection through 2 destructive world wars, and Boulogne got heavily bombed in both wars. Until recently, the Pinard collection was unknown in Kodiak, and then in the late 1990s, thanks largely to Lydia Black, the professor, and a doctoral dissertation by one of her students, Dominique Desson, the news began to spread. Certain individual Aleutic artists made the trip to Boulogne-sur-Mer to look at them. And Sven Haakensen Jr., freshly come as director of the museum, began to stop by in Boulogne on his way to conferences in Europe. He immediately knew the masks had to be seen in Kodiak. And then there followed a series of protracted and difficult negotiations. At first, Haakensen met a stone wall. It was out of the question, hors question, that the masks should travel to Alaska. Pinard's collection was considered to be a natural patrimony, heritage of France, a patrimony recording the heroic history of French scientific exploration. Moreover, there was fear of a repatriation effort, a widespread belief that the collection might never return if it was sent on loan to Alaska. Many discussions, and arguments ensued, and it took a change of generations in the French museum system, as particularly at the Chateau Musée, a new director, Anne-Claire Laronde, who, looking beyond an older curatorial, possessiveness, saw the potential of linking the 2 patrimonies represented by the old masks. And she and Haakensen formed an alliance. They overcame formidable bureaucratic obstacles and organized a traveling exhibit of half of the Pinard collection, some 35 impressive masks. A turning point, an important moment in the seemingly endless negotiations came in 2006 when Haakensen led a delegation of Sukpiak artists to Boulogne-sur-Mer. The human connections they made broke down any remaining resistance there. Whatever stereotypes of Alaska natives may have persisted in provincial France were countered by this collection of individuals. The artists represented several generations from many walks of life. Some had been corporate executives, others looked and acted like fishermen, janitors, office workers, artists. And seeing these grown men and women weeping in the presence of the old masks certainly made an impression on their hosts. Armed with notebooks and cameras, for several days the artists worked hard. They needed to study the old masks closely, hoping to make them live again in new works. I think you can see how big these masks, some of them are. Some of the masks are very large and deeply carved, and this scale and three-dimensionality could not be perceived from the few photographs that had previously been available. Now, this is Doug Inga, who carved that mask that we saw a while before. Now a few scenes from the opening of the exhibition in 2008, where I attended this opening. Those pictures you just saw were not taken by me. They were taken by one of the members of the visiting group and published in a museum publication, and I used them with his permission. But these pictures were taken by me. This is the opening of the museum, 3 generations of Alutiiq. That's Sven Håkansson, of course, on the right. The things are out of place. This is a distorted image of one of the Alutiiq masks. See what comes next. Here we're back to the opening. Some youth dancers in traditional garb. Male and female dance groups, all ages, shapes and sizes. This is a picture of a dance, of a mask actually being danced, and this mask is a copy, or it's based on one of the masks in the Pinar collection. Let me try to show you some of what the masks look like. These are all distorted, I'm afraid. So imagine them stretched vertically, but perhaps you can get some idea of the kind of look. It's a pity. Well, that's a little better. It still should be stretched more vertically. Now, I've been keeping you here for a while, but although we did start late, I've got another 10, maybe 15 minutes. And so hang in there. There'll be a few more pictures, and I want to reflect a bit on some of the issues that this story raises for me. I'll first focus a bit on the pragmatics and politics of repatriation, and then a bit on the diverse social functions of native art. The Alutiiq Museum's ongoing relations to the Pinar collection in France have been opportunistic and flexible. The return of a mask was a kind of repatriation, but not of the all-or-nothing kind. Rather, it opened a reciprocal process of ongoing exchanges. It would have been possible to take a hard line on cultural property here. I mean, Alphonse Pinar was an avid collector, and he was not troubled by appropriating the old masks from a secret cave in the name of science. His otherwise detailed research notes are silent on how exactly he acquired the now priceless artifacts. But nonetheless, contemporary Alutiiq people do not appear interested in portraying him as an exploitative colonial collector. Pinar was young and relatively powerless. The ethnological and linguistic documentation attached to the objects he gathered was, for its time, scrupulous and respectful. He arrived at the last moment it was possible to find the old masks. And he wasn't responsible for their disappearance in the wake of invasion and enslavement, epidemics, missionaries, and all the rest. Today there's widespread agreement that in this case, so-called salvage collecting, whatever its motivations, turned out to be a good thing. At least when Supiaq today, at least when they're writing and speaking publicly, praise Pinar and they praise the staff of the museum in Boulogne for preserving their heritage, which would not be there without these French people. And no doubt statements like this are diplomatic. They're essential for building trust and securing the masks' loan. But I would like to suggest that this generous attitude to a cultural resource held in a distant city also prefigures an alliance we might be prepared to call post-colonial. And I use that word with hesitation, but I think we do need to use it sometimes. It needs to be something that we are aiming toward, even if we never get there. Future travels for the Pinar masks are now being planned, and internet links and new technologies of representation can make a collection actually live in two places at once. And there are exchanges going on between the two provincial museums, the Alutiiq Museum and the one and the Chateau Musée. Alutiiq people going to do dances or to have kayak building workshops, and on the one hand, and the Chateau Musée developing a program to purchase indigenous art, native art from Alaska. A kind of possibilities which simply were not there before. One shouldn't exaggerate the possibilities, but they're real. World-making engagements linking here two peripheral places can be seen as a kind of alternate globalization. From below, if you like, or perhaps at the edge, globalization at the edge. Indeed, the confidence with which Supiaq have felt able to appreciate the French contributions to their ongoing tradition derives from a cultural dynamism that finds inventive ways to connect with the distant artifacts through artistic, technological, and museological practices. Ownership of heritage in this realm of activities is not an all or nothing proposition. And there's an open question about whether this success story that I'm telling you is an exception or whether it is representative of a trend. And I can't answer that. If anyone asks me, I can't answer it. It is not an isolated exception, I will say that. There are trends underway in the direction that I'm talking about. The UBC, the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver, University of British Columbia, which has been a leader in terms of seeing museums as interactive institutions with their resource communities, in this case Northwest Coast tribes, has really continues to innovate in this area. I've been on an advisory committee for that museum, and I've been able to follow it. At this point, that museum is more like a lending library than a final destination for objects. And the relationship of the museum to contemporary native art and the way that contemporary art connects with traditional art is very productive up there. And they make the traditional pieces available to artists, they make them available to elders and to young people for various forms of learning and cultural renewal. So this is a different view of the museum than the one that sees it as the final resting place of objects, you know, which are then cared for lovingly and knowingly by curators, but curators who, you know, have that protectionist attitude. So things are changing, and the UBC Museum is not the only place. I could list others, but I want to move on because the room is warm and you've been very patient. A few words now about the mask's new life as both heritage treasures and commodified art. The Supiaq who visited Boulogne-sur-Mer identify themselves as artists, at least much of the time. They're painters, sculptors, woodworkers, jewelry makers, basket weavers. They make objects that are in differing ways expressions of a living native tradition. The Pinar masks are understood as models for their work. Some of the artists, like Lina Amason, who we saw in that first image of the artists in Boulogne, some, like Lina Amason, experiment freely. Others, like Perry Eaton or Sven Haakensen in his workshop, make rather rigorous copies. But we should pause for a moment on the word copy. Copy, its opposite, original, is accorded primary value in our familiar systems of authentication. A copy is secondary, of lesser value. But in Sugpiaq practice, and indeed in many other indigenous traditions, making a copy renews what is most real, substantial, and we might plausibly say authentic in a material object. What matters are the stories and the songs associated with the mask, or the dances and the reciprocal social exchanges associated with the mask's performances. And in this ontology, a new version of a Pinar mask is as important, perhaps even more important, than an old version immobilized in a collection. To be an artist means participating in worlds of consumption, meeting the expectations of collectors, tourists, galleries, and museums. And in this sense, the identity artist is the result of what in theoretical terms we might call an interpolation, of being called to an institutionalized social role, and finding fulfillment there in that role. However, there's more to being a native artist than that. From Vancouver to the Australian outback, tribal art is an integral part of Indigenous social and cultural resurgence. In practice, being a native artist means connecting, articulating discrepant worlds. Helen Simeonoff, one of the artists we saw, paints landscapes and cats. She also paints compositions inspired by the Pinar collection. Lena Amasan inventively extends the formal structure of the masks into sculptures designed to hang on walls. Alfred Naumoff builds kayaks, both reduced models and full-sized versions, according to traditional specifications. Native artists make art for sale. They also produce finely crafted heritage valuables and ceremonial accoutrements. Where does art stop and living tradition begin in this spectrum of social, economic, and cultural projects? Art, like culture, is a process of recruitment into dominant roles, but simultaneously an expansion and a subversion of these roles. If we cannot decide whether the new prominence of Sugpiaq artists is a matter of interpolation or articulation, so be it. This indeterminacy defines the real. This will perhaps be my final image. The current renewal of masking is prominently displayed on the exhibition catalog's dedication page, and this is a version of that page. Yeah, a little bit stretched. After a tribute to several recently deceased elders, including one non-Sugpiaq, the historian Lydia Black, a color photo appears bearing the caption, quote, "Phyllis Clough dances a memorial mask carved by Perry Eaton in honor of her late father, Sven Håkansson Sr." End quote. The mask is large and elaborately painted, adorned with feathers, resembles models from the Pinar collection. Phyllis Clough, wearing a red anorak and jeans, dances on her knees, which is the woman's way of dancing in Eskimoan traditions, arms spread wide. Now, this kind of memorial masking was an active part of Sugpiaq tradition in the 19th century. It evidently has a future. One wonders, and one will need to pay attention to which other aspects of an older way of life will be renewed in the ongoing cultural mix, in the selective tradition, as Raymond Williams always called it. What elements from the past will be brought forward in new relational contexts, and which elements will be dropped? As the lost and found masks of the Pinar collection return to Kodiak, physically and virtually, they function as objects of historical knowledge, as occasions for museum contemplation or sacred veneration, and as generative tools for use now. They find their second life in overlapping contexts. These include the world of indigenous identity politics, where transformed groups such as the Alutiiq or Sugpiaq achieve distinction through iconic cultural symbols, as we've seen with the return of the masks to Kodiak. Through iconic cultural symbols, achieving distinction. We're in the world of Frederick Barth, where distinctions need to be made. Alutiiq and Sugpiaq had a lot of history in common. There had to be an effort made to distinguish the two groups. Alutiiq and Yupik to the north had linguistic languages, which are Eskimoan languages, which are really quite close to each other, and so a distinction has to be drawn there. Having their own iconic masks, you know, is very much an important part of saying, this is us, we are not like you, we are not like you. This is very much part of identity politics for transformed groups like the Alutiiq. The masks also play a role in the proliferating world of tribal art, where they provide models for new creations that can be sold to collectors or acquired by museums. And also, more intimately, community and personal contexts that value heritage objects derived from traditional forms may want to acquire or be part of the remaking of masks. And public, and in this case private ceremonies, where new versions of the masks are danced, accompanied by songs and stories. This is very much part of their second life, but their second life also takes place in tourism venues, where the old forms become stylized logos on jewelry or clothing and other souvenirs sold to visitors. How these different contexts of cultural production and consumption exist in tension and balance, and what constitutes a proper balance, is a matter of community debate and social experiment. It's also an effect of political economic constraint and opportunity. I've kept you a long time. Let me have a couple more minutes, if you don't mind, because I don't get to Poznan very often. And I'll just do my little very short ending here for you, if the slides will permit. A few last reflections on the messy relational world of Alutiiq art and heritage in postmodernity. On the day after the exhibition, which was called Ginakuk, or Like a Face, after the Like a Face exhibit opened in Kodiak, I drove out of town on the island's longest road, which is 60 kilometers long. That's the longest road in the entire island of Kodiak, which is the second largest island in the United States. The big island in Hawaii is the biggest. I drove out this road with the director of the Chateau Musée, Anne-Claire Laronde, and Martine Chenet, who is a French woman who has sunk roots, who lives now in Kodiak, and who runs a coffee luncheon establishment renowned for its French pastries. And we drove through the gigantic US Coast Guard base, an installation that patrols a vast arc of the North Pacific Ocean. And at the end of the road, 60 kilometers down, we came to the Kodiak Launch Center on the island's southernmost coast. You can see that it's called the Other Cape. That refers to Cape Canaveral, which is, of course, the place where all of the big, the space shuttle is launched in Florida. This is the Other Cape. This aerospace complex, originally built for commercial satellites and with investment participation by Alutiiq tribal corporations, the tribal corporations were involved, has become an integral part of the United States missile defense system, the so-called Star Wars project, ongoing. And from here, they fire test rockets, both toward the Marshall Islands in Micronesia and toward California, where the rockets are launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is just down the coast from where I live in California. Now, entry to the missile site was restricted, so we just sat by the side of the road and picnicked. We could see radar dishes and tall storage structures in the distance. And as we enjoyed a wonderful French lunch, I thought about Connectivity. Well, this is my problem, I guess. You know, if you're having a nice French lunch with, I was thinking about global connectivity. The French call this a déformation professionnelle. Anyway, connectivity. The travels of a young linguist ethnographer in 1871 had linked Kodiak Island to France. In 2007, museums from 2 small fishing cities were forging an alliance. I remembered a poster I had seen on the wall of the Alutiiq Museum's storage area. Now this has been distorted as well. It's just, you have to imagine it longer, not squished. This poster featured a mixed media artwork entitled Otter Girl. Otter Girl. What's the word for otter in Polish? Anyone know? A sea otter or a... Okay, just to be sure. That was why the Russians were in Alaska. They wanted otters. They wanted otter skins because that's the only thing you could sell to the Chinese that they wanted. And they wanted them. Never mind. Sea otters. Otter Girl is the title, and it's by Lina Amason, who we saw among the Sugpiaq artists who had traveled to the Chateau Musée in 2006. Beneath the words at the top, "We are all connected," a painted portrait of a sea otter set against a watery blue background. Above the otter, a fish swims, and attached around these central images is a ring of stylized seabirds painted on small plaques, with bright beads and feathers above. The composition, a face inside a decorated ring, is a modern translation of an old Sugpiaq mask design. Now the occasion for the poster was recorded at the bottom, down here. And this, if we're fortunate, that's what this says. It says, Kodiak Kenai, Kenai is the name of the peninsula, the Alaska Peninsula nearby, Kodiak Kenai Fiber Link Project completion. Kodiak Kenai Cable Company, LLC, and Old Harbor and Uzinki Company, January 2007. So fiber link, everyone know what a fiber link cables are? What do you say? You know, I mean, if you want broadband computer, if you want a fast internet connection, you need fiber link cables, okay? So, Old Harbor Native Corporation, remember that Sven Håkansson grew up in Old Harbor. Old Harbor Native Corporation, with collaboration from Uzinki Native Corporation, a neighboring village, and the launch site administration had recently invested in fiber optic communications. The cable project, addressing a growing need for high-speed links, connected the mainland with Kodiak City, with the mainland of Alaska to Kodiak City, to the Coast Guard base, and to the aerospace facility. Considered essential for the launch site's participation in the missile defense system, the new link also permitted remotely guided emergency surgery at the Kodiak Hospital. You know, you could do surgery in Kodiak or guided by doctors in Anchorage, for example. Back to the poster. Lina Amason Burns lives in Old Harbor, where she leads a dance revival group and participates in Alutiiq language research. These activities, these heritage activities, are also supported by the Old Harbor Native Corporation. This is my last paragraph. Her evocative artworks are now being acquired by museum collections. Amason Burns, who has worked in commercial salmon fishing and knows aquatic animals, makes assemblages that are cross-species conversations. Her art expresses a cultural and an ecological vision. We are all connected. The poster was produced by the Old Harbor Corporation, owners of the artwork in question. The poster evokes a nexus of projects and ongoing histories: indigenous renewal, native arts, fiber optic links, and business opportunities. How to understand this tangle, this jumble or intersection of different stakeholders and histories? How to understand them all, both separately and together? I would like to suggest in closing that no single narrative, no unambiguous ethical or political perspective can account for the cross purposes and the possibilities of Native life today. The U.S. Strategic Defense Initiative enjoys improved connectivity, joining local and wider worlds. And so does the Alutiiq Museum. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your patience. And I didn't say thank you for coming out on your holiday. I appreciate it.
Well, we have. I probably should start with an apology for starting late. This is a part of our Poznań heritage. We start on time, and we consider it a part of our Prussian heritage, although they are not that punctual in Prussia anymore, as they have these Banya or Orthodox churches in Alaska or in Kodiak Island. So, well, we have a time for a couple of questions. We'll run into the lunch break a little bit, but I think that there are many ideas that can be addressed here about connectivity, Nokia connecting people, and also heritage. I just would like to mention that Poland has just signed a convention on intangible heritage, and Polish ethnological community is electrified by the idea of contributing to the World Heritage in this way by participating in work on it. Okay, but there are many questions. Okay, you are first. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. My name is Anya Horolec. I would like just to connect to your use of distinction in Barth's meaning, and my question is about, can we also connect to Bourdieu's meaning of distinction when talking to heritage and indigenous art, in a way that whether there's some legitimate culture being produced and there is an unequal access within the community to it. Thank you.
Well, that's an excellent question, and to talk about Bourdieu would essentially, for me, raises the question of class distinction and sees the issue of distinction as more or less within a single society in terms of forms of hierarchy, stratification, which for us tends to mean class stratification. There's certainly an element of that I didn't discuss in this talk that I do try to discuss in the book of internal distinction and hierarchy within Alutiiq society and tradition, and it's complicated. It's a complicated story that I won't go into, but I'll just say two things about it. I mean, first of all, let's disabuse ourselves. Let's erase the idea that we might have that tribal people are egalitarian, right? And that they don't have distinctions, hierarchical distinctions within them. I mean, some tribal groups are egalitarian. The Yupik to the north of the Alutiiq people are, on the whole, traditionally more about an egalitarian tribal society. The people to the south, on the Tlingit, the Northwest Coast Indians to the south, are well known for being hierarchical societies, having aristocracies and inherited chieftainships and things like that. The Alutiiq are right in the middle. They share cultural elements with the people in the south and also with the north. But they have always been a hierarchical society since, as long as anyone of us knows anything about them, from the time the Russians arrived in the late 18th century. And the Russians re-articulated a local hierarchy in their own terms, in terms of what they call the creation of Creole elites. I don't know how many of you know anything about Russian Empire. It's very interesting, and I've learned a little bit about it. I mean, it's different from other empires in that, you know, they never had enough ethnic Russians to run their empires, all the way across Siberia, you know, all the way across continental Russia and into Alaska. So they needed to create elites. So they encouraged intermarriage. You know, in British or French empires, intermarriage was not okay. You know, that was going native. But for Russians, they wanted to create Creole elites, and they used the term Creole, taken from Latin America, explicitly, to talk about Creole in Russian. So they created Creole elites, and they did that in Alaska. They needed artisans, they needed people to run various technical operations for them, and just to organize the empire, because there were only a few real Russians around. Remember, this was not an empire of settlement. It was not a settler colonial empire. It was an extractive empire. They were there for furs. But so they created Creole elites. And the Creoles, over the 19th century, came to identify as Russian and came to consider themselves better than the native people, what we might think of as indigenous. And there was a sort of distinction there. It was a complicated distinction, and actually, it was stronger among women. Actually circulated between these two. I mean, it wasn't an absolute distinction, but there was something like a class. I say something like a class distinction because I'm very wary of projecting class analysis onto situations like that. But what did occur to some degree at the moment of ANCSA, of the Native Claims Settlement Act in 1970, was that Creole elites, who had been the sort of leadership class in Kodiak, identified as Russian, which is, you know, a way of being not American, you know, so that's significant too. Their status had been waning as more and more Americans were coming in from the South, and so their special status was waning. So they took the advantage, when ANCSA came along and when indigeneity came along, when it became possible to be Alutiiq, and to be not only Alutiiq, but to be a member of development corporations, many of those Creole elites redefined themselves as indigenous in the new context. And so there was a way that an older mode of distinction, pre-contact mode of distinction, transformed in the Russian system, in the Russian Empire, retransformed now in the late American Empire, you know, or the sort of postmodern neoliberal, we might say, economic system after 1970, they become the leaders of these new corporations. So there's a class story within Alutiiq society. But it's a complicated class story because indigenous identification did not produce separatism, class separatism. I mean, there was distinction, but it's not like that they went off and lived, you know, in fancy communities and had nothing to do with the other Alutiiq people. There was much more. In other words, the cultural or the ethnic cross-cut the class there in important ways. But the distinctions are real of wealth and power within Alutiiq society. Now this is a situation, see, it's a complicated local re-articulation of hierarchies coming into, through different imperial and capitalist moments. And, you know, indigenous identity and heritage work is involved with this. The heritage work I was showing you at the Alutiiq Museum is funded by these native corporations, you know, and where do they get their money? But, you know, what do they use their money for? I mean, they get their money by doing business. And some of it is not very edifying, is not very stuff that we might find distasteful, but like a lot of business. But nonetheless, they are busy, they also they don't just get wealthy, they have a mandate to fund heritage work, heritage revival, also health centers, education, health, heritage. These are the mandates of the native corporations. So they're capitalist corporations, but with a difference. So anyway, Bourdieu would be an interesting thing, but I would be wary of his, I'm not sure how much Bourdieu, in his later work anyway, held on to a kind of cross-cultural attitude that he had in his early work when he was working in you know, North Africa. Do you? I mean, how translatable is Bourdieu really, you know, I mean, I need to actually revisit Bourdieu in the light of this particular set of problems. But he's basically writing about Europe, right? He's not really writing. And notions of class distinction have to be translated when you move into histories and situations like this. Which is not to say they're not important. I mean, your question is an excellent one. I'm sorry that was so long, but it's, I at least find it a fascinating bit of social history.
And I, Andrzej Zaborowski, would like to ask you a question about heritage and the linked category of determination, as you said, according to Williams.
I'm sorry,
I'm talking about determination and heritage.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there are also three other categories by the same author: the dominant, the emergent, and the residual.
Yeah.
And my question is, could you combine the two? Because if we take those mass has been primarily the residual and they become emergent, in what sense they can come into relation of determination? Is it due to political issues or due to connectiveness, or how could you describe this? Thank you.
Well, that's a complicated question. I'm glad you raised those terms from Raymond Williams, dominant, residual, and emergent. And one of the and Williams always used them because he wanted to be sure that in any situation we were never looking at one historicity, but there were always several modes of forms of history overlapping and articulating or overlapping forms. So residual forms might be pre-capitalist forms, they might be non-capitalist forms. I mean, the idea of pre-capitalist suggests a clear development from, you know, feudalism to bourgeois society to something else. And I think we've given up on that story, I think. So then we have to be careful about the built-in narrative directions that we assume. And so one of the interesting things to me about indigenous is, the indigenous problematic is that often the residual, that is tradition, and the emergent are the same thing. I mean, you really can't distinguish them in that way. I mean, by going back, you go forward. And this is true about many traditionalisms, but I think it's especially true in indigenous contexts, because they're basically reaching to a place before colonization, a resource, both real and imagined, I might say, if you'll allow me that indeterminacy, a place before colonization which prefigures in a real way a future after colonization. And that is a kind of way of thinking about history that was not supposed to happen. I mean, that was supposed to be over. And it's very much alive. And I spend a lot of time trying to take it seriously and avoid all the obvious skepticisms that I'm sure we can all think about in thinking about it. But the question of determination of heritage is, I mean, of course, that you raise is, all I would say is that would make a plea for overdetermination in thinking about it. That is, overdetermination in the Althusserian, Lacanian sense of multiple determinations that don't add up, that don't add up to a single, you know, that can't be reconciled and made into a single argument. And I ended my talk by with a plea for a kind of the coexistence, the conjunctural meeting and overlap of different historicities, and a plea for not homogenizing them, not seeing some as residual, some as emergent, some as old, some as new, you know, and lining them up in a direction, in a historical direction or directionality. So for me, determination is always multiple. It has to be multiple, and in that way, it's not a determinism, where in the last analysis, you know, the proverbial last analysis of post-Althusserian Marxism, the economic or the socioeconomic finally determines what happens. I don't believe we ever reach the last instance. We never get there, because in reality, in the realism I'm interested in, everything is always overdetermined. Capitalism is always already articulated. It's always working through local culture, through local religion, through local social formations. Capitalism always works through difference. It does not homogenize. Empires sometimes tried to homogenize. Capital does not need to homogenize and doesn't want to homogenize. It works through difference. It creates division of labor. It works through hierarchy and division of labor. These are two very powerful modes of differentiating. But they're modes of differentiating that when they articulate with local or social or cultural modes, can actually produce something unexpected results. And then capitalism may, because it's so flexible, you know, work with those results, you know, commodify those. Everything is ultimately commodified, but the commodification isn't the end of the story. It's only one thing that happens to cultural heritage. So I'm interested in heritage that, you know, when people say, well, that's a commodified heritage. And I say, yes, it is. It's absolutely commodified. It's sold to tourists. It's simplified. You know, it's not at all the authentic old thing. But what else is it? Is it the seed of anything else? I mean, these masks that were often prohibited and out of existence, they come back and they playing all sorts of roles, predictable roles in heritage ceremonies and tourism and the art market. But it's also doing those private ceremonies and things that suggest a more complex second life. So it's, you know, it's not a rigorous answer. It's as usual, a complexifying answer. That's what I do.
Hello, Jeroen Drozovic. Well, I don't have actually a question, and more a kind of a request on the elaboration of the notion of yours you've made, calling it a disruption in history. Is it that so that the whole discourse on heritage, especially regarding native peoples or what was called primitive peoples back then, suggests, and that was also visible in your presentation, that the discourse on heritage still uses the old patterns of intellectual analysis that imposes the lack of history. For example, it suggests that heritage is related to the view of the good old days, that is the past, the history, and the faded picture of the good old days that is today, and the use of the heritage. And I'm interested in that very moment in history when the Aleut identity became...
When the what? I didn't understand.
The Aleut identity.
Aleut?
Aleut.
Aleutic.
Aleutic, sorry.
Yeah.
So, so it became Aleutic.
Yeah, right.
So that analysis suggests also the lack of native agency. So, and a lack of, well, the Aleutic identity didn't emerge out of the blue, right, so to say. And isn't it so that we leave aside the whole picture of emergence of local identities? So is it so that we still use the whole the old-fashioned to impose certain identities, and we are still attached to that compulsive collecting of things. So first we collected material artifacts, then now we are collecting identities. Thank you.
Now we're collecting identities. That's so. Do you think I'm collecting identities?
No, not at all.
Why not? I mean, I was ready to say guilty as charged. But, I mean, collecting, you know, we're used to, I mean, what's wrong with collecting? The question is, what are the power relations involved in the collecting? If we gave up collecting, I wouldn't want to give up collecting myself. I think it's a universal cultural habit. But anyway, you raised a number of points, and I didn't understand all of them, but some I did, and I think, and there's one that I think, tell me if I'm wrong. When you talked about the articulation of aleutic identity in the 1970s, and said. And talked about a sense of a lack of native agency in that process. I mean, I did it in the context of stressing the ANCSA process, the process of recruitment of people into the Alaska Native Settlement Act's regime. People signing up as one or another of the native peoples of Alaska, you know, and in that sense, it looks very much like a top-down governmental project. But, and I perhaps didn't emphasize enough the other side of the story, which I try, at least when I'm in the chapter this is part of, what I try to do. The other side of that story is local agency and native agency, and it's about ANCSA came about, the reason they did this Settlement Act in 1970, the reason they decided that they really had to settle the land question in Alaska, begins with A, the reason they did it was oil. What happened, they had discovered oil up north, you know, on the north slope in Prudhoe Bay. There was a lot of oil up there, but they needed to get the oil down to the United States, so they had to build a pipeline all the way across Alaska down to Valdez, where the oil spill was in the Queen what's it sound? Queen Charlotte Sound there. Anyway, they had to build this pipeline, but that went across land that native groups claimed, but they didn't own it. Nobody owned it exactly. Maybe the government thought it owned it. It wasn't quite clear. But natives claimed it. But what had happened in the decade before, during the 1950s, was a land claims movement by Alaska Natives and the formation of a group called the Association of Alaska Natives, which was a all-Alaska Native group, organization devoted to land claims and pressing indigenous issues in Alaska. And that was new. I mean, there was agency there. That was, you know, indigenous agency. And because that group existed, the oil companies were not able to simply buy off the local tribes and build their pipeline, you know, which they could have, in the past they might have done. No, all of the Alaska Natives held together on this and said, no, you're not building your pipeline until we get what we want, we get something. And so a big deal was worked out, and Richard Nixon was president, and he did it, and he pushed it, and it was pushed through. So it was a strange alliance between a mobilized native groups and the oil companies, actually against the environmentalists and the hunters, who didn't want that land, you know, accorded to native peoples. So it was, you know, this is the politics of articulation, of very different interests finding enough commonality to produce something. It's a set of partial articulations are always partial connections, and they're always contingent connections. They can be made and they can be unmade. Here they were made. It was an alliance that was made. But what I want to stress there, and then when AXA came in, you know, the enrollment process began that we were talking about. And, but I want to stress that there would be no AXA without native agency. You see, it was the land claims movements and the existence of the Association of Alaska Natives. That's why there was any settlement at all. And to see it simply as a governmental strategy or as some kind of, you know, one-way determination by the state is way too simple. And so, but the way I've been trying to think about indigenous politics will always have a local agency moving into the spaces that neoliberalism is creating. And multiculturalism and neoliberalism is opening up spaces for native people. It's doing it in Guatemala, it's doing it in all over Latin America, you know. These are not innocent spaces, you know. I mean, they're problematic spaces, but local people are using them on their own terms, as well as being used by the government. So it's, you know, but to me, this is realism, you know. This is not about native peoples rediscovering who they really are and finally, you know, coming into the world of sovereignty, of indigenous sovereignty. There's a lot of rhetoric about sovereignty. But sovereignty, in reality, is always negotiated and partial. You know, even the strongest nations don't have complete sovereignty. The USA can't control its borders, you know, and no one knows what the economy is doing. So much for absolute sovereignty. And native peoples, their sovereignty is negotiated in this way. So that's a kind of, I don't know, does this, you know, give you a sense of the existence of native agency at the same time as state agency, that there's a kind of politics of articulation going on? And did that in any way respond to your question?
Yes, it is.
I'm glad.
Well, we are running out of time, but there is last short question and short answer. Okay?
Oh, short answers you want.
I know it's difficult to expect it from you, but...
Thank you very much. I have found very useful your concept of second life. When you described, let's say, the revival of heritage, and I'm curious if we, in this context, you mentioned of the connection between France and Alaska. If we really can use the word revival of the heritage in the sense of indigenous societies of today, or it would be much useful now to think about production of some new heritage which should be used, or it is used by indigenous people as symbolic markers of ethnicity. What do you think about this? Yeah.
Well, this is, again, good question, and the language and the terms we use are not innocent. They all bring something. Revival is a difficult term because it assumes life and death. It's an organic term. Something that's revived is brought back to life, right? So it assumes that this is about life and death. I've spent a lot of time writing against organicism and thinking about culture. Now, the production is more industrial, craft or industrial. And sometimes you'll find I am hesitant when I hear people of a more or less Marxist stripe, most of my friends, you know, talking about the production of this, the production of that. I think, you know, do they leave enough room for this kind of complex agency and interaction of heritage? But the fact is, we're just going to have to use these words and qualify them. I use 3 words for thinking about the process of cultural transformation and heritage making that are useful to me. One you've heard a lot today, which is articulation, that notion of contingent connection and disconnection. The second is performance. You've heard some of that. Performativity and performance. And the third is translation. with the idea that translation works, but it's always imperfect. You know, it's always traduttore, traduttore. Those are 3 words I use, but basically we're not going to come out with a single word that will be adequate to this process. And that's the one thing I've found in my work is I always have to use a cluster of terms, and especially terms that are not synonyms of the same thing, but words that make trouble for each other a little bit. In my work, I want approaches that do not add up. You know, don't come together. But, yeah, that's...
Okay, we are experts in translation. We started with technical translation. It worked somehow, even if not perfectly, as you said. But we were able to get images. So thank you very much for this lecture. Thank you again for coming from all over the country and even beyond the country. And thank you for coming from as far as Berlin to us. And this session is now closed. Thank you very much.